Hello, welcome to Read Through the Word. Today is Wednesday, October 9th. Super glad to have you here today. Today we're talking about, we're in the New Testament. If you're just joining us, we're in the New Testament, and today's reading talked about some pretty big stories that we have probably heard many times about Jesus. The feeding of the 5,000, John the Baptist being beheaded, Jesus walking on the water. So some really big stories. And I want to talk a little bit about just set some context for some of these stories. And then we'll talk about what they mean, what the connection is, and what that means for us today. So the verse, or key verse for today is Mark chapter 6, verses 32 through 34. So they left by boat for a quiet place where they could be alone. But many people recognized them and saw them leaving. And people from many towns ran ahead along the shore and got there ahead of them. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. I feel like that verse encompasses a lot of who Jesus is. Let's dig into the story and learn more about that. So in order to kind of set the stage for just more of who Jesus was and is, and but who he was showing himself to be at that time to people, and what he was trying to accomplish. In order to set that stage, I want to go back a little bit to again this conflict that I've mentioned in a couple different lessons that started all the way back with Jacob and Esau, and that is the conflict between Israel and the descendants of Esau, the Edomites. And if you watched the video back, it was like the second day we were in the New Testament, talked about how Jesus was basically born in the shadow of this mass, not in the literal shadow, but literally just in close proximity to this massive structure that Herod had built, and all Herod's power and structures, and Herod the Great we're talking now, and just the humility and with which Jesus came into the world. And this continual tension with Jesus and Herod continues. So we're going to talk a little bit about this backdrop of Herod here. So first of all, at this time, now that Jesus is an adult, Herod the Great has died, and his land his land and rule has been divided among three of his sons. Herod Archelaus, which got the area surrounding Jerusalem, including Bethlehem. This area ended up being ruled later by Roman procurators. That's a mouthful. Roman procurators. And that's why Pilate ended up being later in charge of that region. Another region was ruled by Herod Antipas. That was the Galilee, more the western side of Galilee and Perea. And then Herod Philip was the third son that had a portion of Herod the Great's territory and rule. And he ruled like the north and east part of Galilee. So we know how wicked and power hungry Herod the Great was. His three sons absolutely followed in his footsteps. And there was also a lot of wickedness. So in the reading for today, it talks about how John the Baptist, how he ended up being beheaded because he spoke out against the wickedness of what Herod Antipas had been doing. So let's give some context. First of all, interesting, I didn't know this. This was a new fact for me, that Herod Antipas had a Samaritan mother. Maybe I did know that, or maybe I forgot, but interesting. And Herodias was the granddaughter of Herod the Great. First, Herodias married her uncle, Herod Philip the First. Remember, Herod Philip is the one that is ruling kind of the north and east part of Galilee. And while Herod Antipas was a guest in the home of Herodias and Philip the First, who were married at the time, Herod Antipas persuaded Herodias to leave and marry him, Philip the First, and marry him. Herod Antipas persuaded her to marry him and leave Philip the First. So also, according to Josephus, this was interesting. The daughter of Herodias and Philip the First was Salome. Remember, that's the daughter that danced for Herod Antipas, okay? She later married her granduncle, Philip the Second. So there was another Philip. He wasn't ruling, but yeah. So lots of wickedness in that family. And when Herod Antipas married Herodias, of course, John the Baptist publicly condemned that. It would have been considered, of course, an incestuous affront to God's law. I listed there Leviticus 18:16 and 20:21. So this big, dramatic, and very evil story happening within this family. And John the Baptist is calling it out on a moral level. But the fact that Herod Antipas divorced his first wife and basically, committed adultery with and brought in a second wife, okay, and totally morally compromised, also offended his former father-in-law. So the father of his first wife, he was the Nabatean king, and ultimately leading to a war eventually in which Herod's honor suffered greatly. So many of Herod Antipas's subjects, especially in the region where John was probably preaching and then later imprisoned, were ethnic Nabateans and probably had some divided loyalties. So Herod could have perceived John's condemnation as kind of a political threat too. Like, you're really emphasizing how bad this looks, that I divorced this woman, the son or the daughter of this Nabatean king, and there are Nabateans in his kingdom, and so there's some divided loyalty there, and John's preaching might very well have also sort of stirred up the political threat that possibly Herod was feeling as a result of his wicked decision. So very interesting backdrop there. Let's keep that in our mind here. Just kind of the mess that is Herod's family and the threat that Herod feels from John the Baptist, okay? When Jesus, we're going to switch now to what was happening with Jesus. Jesus finds out about John the Baptist's death, and it says he and his disciples, to a private place. And I thought, this is so important, I think, for us to understand that we have times where we absolutely need to step back. Even Jesus did it. When you experience grief or loss, or when you have been through something traumatic, or been through a stressful time, it's really important that you know that it is okay and even good and just like Jesus, to take a step back and to rest. To rest and to try to recover. The world will still be there when you get back. All the busy things that feel like they need to get done, they will all be there. So I think that Jesus modeled that well. So he and his disciples went to Bethsaida. This was in north. So the north I wish I had a map, but I don't. Please check out a map of this because this was interesting. So if you think of like Galilee, the northwest part of Galilee was really the more populated area. The more northeastern side was much more wilderness. It was, when the disciples later said, we don't have food. There's no food anywhere. They were right. They were more in a wilderness, a more secluded area. But when I first read where Bethsaida was, I was like, why would they have to take a boat to go there? Because if you look at the map, it's Gennesaret and then Capernaum and then Bethsaida. Like they didn't need a boat. So I did some digging on this, and that area that they kind of considered or would say Bethsaida, if you follow the map further south and along the eastern part of Galilee, that is most likely where they were when the disciples and Jesus crossed over, and then the crowds came. And Jesus had compassion. He was tired, right? He was tired. He was looking for a place to recover. But here come these people, and he still has compassion on them. Anyway, so look at a map to kind of help with that, and we're going to talk about that more in a second. It also made me think of the fact that sometimes I feel like when I am run down or I need recovery, that I am kind of useless, right? There's nothing in me worthwhile to give, or I'm just out for the count and there's nothing good that God can really do with me. And when you think about Jesus crossing over and the grief that he and the disciples must have felt, it's not that they stopped grieving, and it's not that they didn't take time to grieve. But when they were met with these people and they were met with this opportunity, Jesus did one of the greatest miracles. He fed over 5,000 people, right? It was probably more like 15,000 because 5,000 is just probably the number of men. Jews actually did not permit women and children to eat with men in public, so they were most likely in separate groups. So the count of the men was 5,000, but it obviously was probably closer to like 15,000 total with the women and children. So one of the greatest miracles, right, that we read about came at a time when Jesus was deeply grieved. And if you have ever felt like you are not yourself or you don't have much to give, I want you to remember that story. Because no matter what you're going through or how much you feel like you have to give, or maybe if you feel like you're just not able to do anything important because of what you've been through or what you're recovering from, I want you to remember this story and remember miracles happen anywhere, anytime. And you don't have to be, well rested and emotionally perfect and mentally and physically perfect in order for God to do a miracle through you and in you. So this massive miracle happens, which, by the way, I like this. It would have been reminiscent to them of the story in the Old Testament of the manna that was provided, right? And the miracle of Elisha. It was on a much smaller scale. I think it was only like 100 people, but the miracle of when Elisha made bread multiply and filled easily filled the crowd. So there was context there definitely would have been the context of those things in the minds of these people. And they're going, whoa, okay. They're thinking, what are the possibilities that this king can do for us? Maybe they were thinking earthly king, right? Because they wanted to try to make him a king. Like, whoa, he can produce enough bread to feed all of us. What better attribute of a king than that? We'll never go hungry. So, and I love how Jesus too didn't just supply their spiritual needs. He supplied their physical needs. They were both important. So you have this picture here of Jesus doing this great miracle. And even in the midst of grief, and the people are seeing so many different things as a result of this miracle about Jesus. And then it gets time, it's done. He sends the crowds away, and it comes time for, he tells the disciples to go to the other side in the boat, and he's going to come later. He goes to a mountain to be alone and to pray, to recover, right? To continue to recover. So again, this is where the map comes in. I put a link in your notes. It says map of Galilee where the 5,000 were fed. Please check that out. It's a wonderful representation, because not only can you see the map, but the man in the video shows you he's standing in the area where the feeding of the 5,000 probably happened. And you're able to see, okay, from this kind of area just south of Bethsaida, where the feeding happened, you're able to see to the other side, Capernaum and Gennesaret. And when you look at a map, this is not like from one end of the, this wasn't in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. They weren't going from one end all the way to the other. This was just the northern end. So I'm sure my drawing with my hands doesn't really help. But if you look at a map, you'll see what I mean. If you go down just south of Bethsaida, and you think they had to take the boat to Capernaum, it wasn't that far from the shore, and it wasn't that far of a distance. And I thought, and they rode all night. So this, this squall comes up, this storm, which was not uncommon. It was not uncommon for these storms to pop up on the Sea of Galilee. So these disciples would not have been new to them, but it must have been really bad for them to be that scared. Okay. Because they had experienced these storms before. So it must have been really bad. A bad storm. And so they're, rowing against the wind all night, still couldn't get to shore. I'm telling you, when you look at the map, you'd be like, whoa, that was really bad, because they weren't that far away. It wasn't a long trip. So, and then Jesus shows up around the fourth watch, which was somewhere between 3 to 6 a.m. And I love the words he says. He says, "It is I," which is literally I am. And though "it is I" is an accurate translation, the nuance of "I am" was absolutely present in when Jesus identified himself that way. What a beautiful picture of the kind of God that Jesus was trying to teach people that he was. He was trying to say, this is what my Father looks like, right? This is what the kingdom looks like. This is who I truly am. I'm not a military leader. I don't want to take anything by force. He retreated when those things, came up. That's not what Jesus wanted. And this in contrast to Herod Antipas and his massive power grab, right? He was always striving for power for himself, for his own glory, for his own gain, for his own legacy. It didn't matter who it didn't matter who Herod Antipas had to it didn't matter who he had to hurt or kill or whatever in order to have what he wanted. And here, in the aftermath of John the Baptist having to give his life because of Herod Antipas and this power, right? In the midst of this grief over what Herod did and this power grab, Jesus goes to a remote place and he shows people what power really is. Power was feeding a group of people for no other reason than just to provide and to show them that he could provide for them spiritually as well. He loved them. He cared about them. He cared about his disciples when they were in the boat. He came out and, rescued them and sat with them. He cared about them. So Jesus used his power for the good of the people around him. He used it to show what the kingdom of God really looked like. He used it to show what it meant to love God and love others. He didn't want to be a military leader. He didn't want the kind of power that Herod was striving for. He showed that true power lies in humility, in serving others, in putting others above ourselves, even when we're struggling. And what a beautiful picture we can continue to see there. The contrast and the beauty of the kind of love and the kind of kingdom that Jesus was trying to bring, that Jesus brought. Thanks, and we'll see you next time on Read Through the Word.